suffering is all around us, especially now. Ultimately, it's something we can't escape from, and some seem to experience it in a particularly acute way. If there's a God, people ask, doesn't he care about this? Why does he allow it? It's a reasonable question, and interestingly, usually only one posed to the God of the Christian Bible. So we'll try and answer it from that perspective. Statistics show that in nations where suffering is seemingly high, people are actually often proven to be happier. Could that be linked to the fact that these same people are usually Christians? It also seems to be true that those who have what the world thinks is the opposite of suffering, fame and fortune, are statistically more unhappy. Perhaps it's not coincidental that those people are less likely to have any sort of belief in anything. It's never been more important for us as human beings to try and make sense of all of this. God wants us to ask these questions about suffering because they bring us that bit closer to understanding Him and ourselves. First, it's important to separate suffering caused by man from suffering that seems unrelated to man. Most of the global suffering is caused by the actions of people. Not only things like starvation, but also AIDS, natural disasters caused by man's mistakes or poor building, cancer caused through smoking, we could go on and on. In fact, most issues of suffering fall into the man-influenced category, though even this often prompts the question, okay, so man caused it, but why didn't God then stop it? Well, God has given us free will. Free will to do the right and the wrong thing. God can't keep intervening. If he did, where would he stop? In wars, civil disputes, family arguments, cutting yourself shaving? And if he intervened in everything, we would become little more than robots. That isn't free will. No, if the free will we say we want is to be really free, then God must allow it to be so. That often leads to hurt and suffering, which pains God so much, he sent his only son to die for us, to offer another way. Which brings us to our second point. When we come to accusations of God's impotence when it comes to this kind of suffering, it's interesting that these are virtually always posed by people who have rejected God, yet they are now asking why the being they've rejected doesn't intervene. Most of humankind has made it clear that they don't want God. From that point at the beginning of history, God had to leave us to a fallen world. That, though, was man's choice, not God's. It's interesting that the why does God allow suffering question nearly always seems to be a criticism levelled at Christianity, never at any of the other faiths. You could, in principle, stop this question dead in its tracks by pointing out that the question implies a suggestion that God exists. If he does, then he's the creator of a billion galaxies and we're a speck of dust in comparison. And if that's the case, it would be ridiculous for us to expect to understand everything he does. It's tempting to put God in the dock when we ask questions like this. When we do so, we've made him smaller than we are, and we've made a big mistake. If he is what he is, and we are what we are, then if we look down on him, we'll never, ever see him. The famous writer G.K. Chesterton once responded to an article in the Times entitled, "What's wrong with the world?" He replied, "I am." Our Creator has given us enough knowledge about him for us to know that he is a loving and just God. Because of whom we are and who God is, there'll always be a gap between the end of that knowledge and the things about the world, and particularly about suffering that we don't understand. The choice is whether we choose to bridge that gap in faith or not. First, in a few instances, it may be part of a bigger plan that we can't understand from our vantage point in life and history. Throughout the centuries, we can look back on appalling incidents which appeared catastrophic and barbaric at the time, but without which there would have been greater subsequent bloodshed. Second, unlike God, we can't see the future. God may know of something in the future likely to happen to the victim of suffering far worse than that which they're going through. Viewed in that light, suffering which ends in premature death may, in certain particular circumstances, be an act of mercy on God's part. Third, as C.S. Lewis once said, suffering is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Fortunately, unlike us, God sees the bigger picture, which is that primarily it's not what happens to us here in the short time that we have on earth that's important, it's where we spend eternity. If God is God, really loves us and wants us to know him in that eternity, might not suffering and his mercy be used as a last resort on his part to reach us? God suffers when we suffer. Think of suffering. The mother who has just lost her son in a road accident. The parents who have just lost their baby in a cot death. The husband who has just lost his wife in childbirth. Now think how much greater that suffering would be if each of those had voluntarily given up their loved one to death, had sent them to their death. And not just any death, but a painful, lonely, horrible death. How much greater would that suffering be? Yet, the Bible tells us that's exactly what God did. He gave up his only son to the most horrible death imaginable, the worst form of human execution ever invented, to give us an opportunity for life, to pay the price for all the sins that we personally and collectively have committed. We can choose to take that lifeline, or we can choose to reject it. But either way, don't say that God knows nothing about suffering. He knows everything about it. God shares our pain when we go through suffering in this world. He shares it in the deepest way imaginable. But he knows that such pain for loved ones and for those left behind can at least be short-lived for those who choose to know him. He gives us a chance to start again every day and gives us a chance to start again even when our days are ended. Man may have messed up this world, but at least he can't mess up the next. Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection have opened up our path there, if we choose to take it.